Welcome. This is Animal Encounters. Today I'm breaking down 6 alligator attacks in Florida that remind us how dangerous familiar water can be. From a man stepping into a backyard pond to free a snagged fishing line, to a worker clearing brush beside water where the alligator had learned to expect food. First, we go to a central Florida retention pond, where one stuck fishing line put a man within reach of an alligator no one had taken seriously enough. It was April 14th, 2026. A retention pond sat behind a row of houses in a quiet, central Florida subdivision. Cattails along the edges, never fenced off from anyone's backyard. You have probably driven past 100 ponds exactly like it without a second thought. Alan Bricker lived alone in the house closest to that water, 53 years old, a warehouse supervisor who fished the pond in the evenings, mostly because it gave him something to do after work. He had been there 6 years, and in that time, the pond had just become part of the property to him. Background scenery he barely registered anymore. He knew there was at least one alligator living in it. Most people in that neighborhood knew that too. It becomes one of those facts you file away and stop actively thinking about, the same way you know there could be a spider in your garage and you still walk in there barefoot anyway. Adult male alligators average around 11 to 12 feet and can weigh up to 800 pounds, with some documented past 13 feet. Spring is breeding season, when males get territorial and aggressive, competing for space. And unlike a lot of predators, alligators do not just kill and move on. After a kill, they will often drag the body into deeper water, wedge it under a log or bank, and feed on it over time instead of all at once. Less a single violent moment, more patience. That spring, a few neighbors had already noticed a larger alligator hanging around the eastern bank, right where the cattails grew thickest. 2 hissing incidents got reported to wildlife services that month. Nobody asked for it to be removed though. Alan had seen the animal himself about a week before, sunning on that same stretch of bank, and just gave it a wider path when he walked his dog past it. On the evening of April 14th, Alan messaged a coworker that he was heading out to fish before it got dark, which turned out to be the last anyone heard from him. What we know about what happened after that comes entirely from what investigators pieced together afterward. A neighbor 2 properties down did recall hearing heavy splashing sometime after dark, loud enough to notice, but not loud enough to seem like an emergency. In hindsight, it is an awful thing to have overheard and not known what it meant. The physical evidence at the bank told the rest. Alan's tackle box was still sitting open near the water. His rod later found tangled several feet out in the same patch of vegetation, both consistent with him wading in to free a snagged line, something his neighbors said he had done plenty of times before in that exact spot. Alan did not show up for his shift the next morning and did not answer calls. And it was a coworker who eventually drove to the house, found his truck still in the driveway and his fishing gear missing from the garage, and called it in. Based on the injuries recovered and the position of the body, investigators believe the alligator struck from the cattails and caught Alan across the stomach and lower ribs, a bite pattern consistent with disabling rather than an immediate kill, then pulled him into deeper water and held him there. Search teams located his body the following day, snagged against a submerged log near the center of the pond. By that point, significant tissue loss had already occurred to the torso and one leg, which the coroner attributed to feeding activity that took place after death. Over the hours, the body remained submerged and undiscovered. The coroner listed drowning as the immediate cause of death, with the initial bite injuries to the torso identified as a major contributing factor and extensive post-mortem tissue loss, consistent with feeding activity following death. Investigators cited breeding season aggression in the local alligator population and the complete absence of any barrier separating the pond from the surrounding yards. Wildlife officers later removed an alligator matching the size and location neighbors had already described in the weeks before. Alan's tackle box and rod, along with the co-worker's account of his last message, helped establish the timeline of that evening. Not long after, the pond finally got a partial barrier fence along the residential side. It kind of makes you wonder how many ponds near your own house have never gotten one, and whether it takes something like this for anyone to actually notice. Next up is Southwest Florida, where a single photo near the water put a retired teacher within reach of an alligator that had been getting bolder for weeks. It was September 2nd, 2023. A golf course community in Southwest Florida wound its fairways around a series of connected ponds, the kind of drainage feature landscapers use all over that state to double as scenery. Most people who played there long enough had their own story about spotting an alligator sunning near a green. Marilyn Osgood was 66, a retired school teacher who had taken up golf after moving into the community 4 years earlier. She played 9 holes most evenings with her neighbor, Todd Herman, 62, a retired contractor who lived 2 doors down. Neither of them were serious golfers. It was really just an excuse to get outside after dinner and talk about their days, and Marilyn's shots ended up near the water hazards more often than she would have liked, something Todd used to tease her about on nearly every round. Todd later admitted he did not care much about the game itself. He just missed having her there, giving him a hard time about his own shots. It is a strange kind of grief, missing someone over something as small as a bad shot on a golf course. Alligators in golf course ponds tend to grow bigger than people expect, since they face almost no hunting pressure and have a steady food supply of waterfowl and fish for years at a stretch. Groundskeepers relocate the larger ones near cart paths, but smaller connecting ponds like the one along the 6th hole rarely get that attention. And an alligator, used to golfers, retrieving balls near the water without consequence, does not treat someone crouched at the edge any differently than someone just walking past. That evening, Marilyn's tee shot on the 6th hole landed just short of the pond, close enough to the edge that she decided to retrieve it rather than take the penalty stroke. She had pulled balls out of that same rough plenty of times before and never once had a problem. Todd was a few yards behind her, still walking up from his own shot, when he saw her crouch near the waterline. He watched the alligator surface almost silently, closer to the bank than he expected, something that size to get without being noticed, and closed the last few feet faster than he had time to call out a warning. Marilyn must have caught some movement at the last second, because she jerked back just as it lunged, though it was already too late to fully pull away. It caught her by the arm as she reached for the ball, and the force of it dragged her forward onto her knees at the water's edge. Todd grabbed her other arm and pulled back with everything he had, bracing one foot against the slope of the bank for leverage. For a second, it felt like a tug of war he was not going to win. Then the alligator let go on its own, and Marilyn came free and fell backward onto the grass. The whole exchange could not have lasted more than 4 or 5 seconds, though Todd would later say it felt much longer than that. The bite had torn through the upper arm deep enough to open the brachial artery. Blood was already soaking into the grass by the time he got her flat on her back. He pressed down with both hands, but the wound sat high and awkward, hard to fully compress, and the bleeding barely slowed, while he shouted for help from anyone else on the course and got his phone out with one hand still pressing down. Another golfer 2 holes over heard Todd shouting and came running with a towel from his own bag, but by the time he reached them, there was very little left to do beyond adding pressure to what Todd was already doing. Paramedics arrived within several minutes, but by then she had already lost more blood than her body could recover from. She was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after. The medical examiner listed exsanguination as the cause of death from a single bite that severed the brachial artery faster than direct pressure alone could control. Investigators noted how close the pond's edge sat to the fairway and how routine it had become for golfers across that community to retrieve stray balls near the water without a second thought. Todd's account, given at the scene and again in the days after, formed the basis of the official record. The course added stricter signage near several hazards within a month and began roping off the closest edges to the cart paths, including the section along the 6th hole. There is something awful about losing someone in the middle of an ordinary shared ritual. One day it's just golf after dinner, and then the next that same course becomes a place you probably avoid without even meaning to. At a cattle farm still drying out after a storm, a man walked into murky water to check damaged fencing, not knowing an alligator had settled against the submerged bank. It was September 28th, 2018. A cattle farm in North Florida was still drying out from a tropical system that had pushed water across the low pasture the week before. Fences along the northern boundary had been damaged, and some of the drainage ditches were still flooded badly enough that the original banks were hard to see. Earl Denning was 44, a farmhand who had worked that property for over a decade. He knew the fields, fence lines, the low patches, and which ditches usually kept water the longest. Under normal conditions, he could have walked that northern boundary without thinking much about where to step. After a storm, though, familiar land can turn into a guessing game, and this time the guess mattered. Floodwater does strange things in Florida. It moves branches, trash, fence posts, snakes, and sometimes alligators. They can end up in drainage ditches, culverts, flooded pasture, and low farm roads far from where people are used to seeing them. In clear water, you might get a ripple or a pair of eyes. In brown water full of grass and silt, you get nothing useful. That is the part I think people forget about floodwater. It does not just cover danger, it moves danger into places where you would never think to look. A couple of nearby farms had already mentioned alligators showing up in odd places after the storm, including one resting near a fence post, nowhere close to a pond. Earl had heard about those sightings in passing, but that is how information spreads in rural places sometimes. Enough to be aware of it, not enough to cancel the work. His supervisor had even mentioned checking the ditch line in pairs until the water receded, but with half the crew dealing with storm cleanup elsewhere on the property, Earl ended up going out alone. The fence damage was worst along the northern ditch line. Floodwater still covered the bank there, about knee-deep in places, muddy, warm, and full of broken grass stems from the storm. Earl moved slowly, checking the posts and feeling for the ditch edge with each step, because the ground dropped away unevenly under the water. The alligator was pressed against the submerged bank. Earl stepped into its space before he could see it. The bite came upward into his lower leg, catching the calf and ankle area, then released almost immediately as the animal pulled back into deeper water. There was no long struggle, no dragging, no death roll. Just one defensive strike from an animal hidden in dirty water. The wound was bad, but not the kind that always makes people panic right away. Deep punctures, torn skin, bruising around the calf, and mud forced into the tissue. Earl got himself back to the farmhouse, washed it out, wrapped it with what was there, and did not seek medical care that day, thinking he had dealt with the worst of it. And I know that sounds wild, but people who work farms are built a little differently. A lot of them grew up around cuts, bites, punctures, rusty metal, and the general idea that if you can still walk, you're probably fine. By the next day, the leg was swollen and stiff. By the second, the skin around the bite had darkened, and the pain had moved farther up his leg. A fever started after that, along with chills and weakness that he tried to blame on exhaustion from cleanup work. By the fourth day, walking became difficult. A family member finally got him to medical care. At that point, the infection was no longer just in the bite wound. An alligator bite can introduce a mix of bacteria from the animal's mouth and the water around it, and floodwater only adds more contamination. Once that combination gets deep into damaged tissue, the body can lose control of the infection fast. Earl was treated with antibiotics and supportive care, but his blood pressure dropped, his organs began shutting down, and the infection moved into full septic shock. He died 6 days after the bite. The coroner listed septic shock as the cause of death, originating from a bacterial infection introduced through the bite wound and worsened by floodwater contamination. Contributing factors included the delay in treatment and the depth of the puncture wounds. The record included Earl's account given before he deteriorated, the first aid materials recovered from the farmhouse, and reports of displaced alligators on nearby properties after the storm. The farm's owner later required that anyone treating an animal bite, alligator or otherwise, be seen by a doctor within 24 hours, regardless of how minor the wound looked at first. Farm toughness is real, but it has limits. An alligator bite in floodwater is exactly where those limits show up. In the Everglades region, a man had enough light to see his fishing line, but not enough to see the alligator moving through the water toward him. It was June 8th, 2016. A drainage canal on the edge of the Everglades ran alongside a rural access road, banks low and unlit. Canals like this scattered all through that part of Florida. Locals fished it for catfish that bit best after dark, and everyone who fished there regularly understood the canal held alligators. Nobody treated that as a secret. Regulars at that canal tended to fall into two categories: the ones who fished it during the day out of caution, and the ones who fished it at night because that is when the catfish actually bit. Bernard Ambrose was 59, a retired mechanic who had fished that same stretch after dark for close to 2 decades. He avoided the section near a culvert further down, where alligators tended to congregate, and stuck to the part closer to the access road instead. He fished alone most evenings, setting up a folding chair right at the water's edge with a headlamp clipped to his cap for light. Alligators become significantly more active after dark, especially through the warmer months, and their eyes reflect light in a way experienced night fishermen learn to spot from a distance. 2 small points glowing low across the surface. A headlamp cuts both ways out there. It shows you your line and your bait, but it also marks exactly where you are sitting for anything moving through the water nearby. That is the strange trade night fishing asks you to make. The same light that helps you see is the same light telling everything else exactly where you are. In the weeks leading up to the incident, another regular at the canal had mentioned an alligator behaving differently than usual. coming in closer to the bank, not spooked by people or light the way most of them were. It came up once in conversation and nothing more. Nobody wrote it down anywhere or reported it to wildlife services. Bernard set up in his usual spot along the access road stretch. Chair close to the water, headlamp aimed at the point where his line went under. His attention stayed fixed there, on the small circle of light around his hook, the same narrow focus most night fishermen fall into after enough hours on the water. The Alligator crossed the last stretch of open water without any sound loud enough to register over the usual night noise. Insects, distant traffic, water lapping against the bank. It came up out of the canal and seized Bernard by the lower leg, the bite closing hard enough to pull him sideways out of the chair before he had any chance to brace against the ground. He went into the water on his back, one leg already caught, and the Alligator immediately began rolling, the kind of motion meant to disorient and pull prey under rather than hold it in place. A fisherman, further down the bank, heard the chair scrape and tip, then a shout, then the heavy, uneven splashing of a struggle in shallow water. He was already moving before he fully understood what he was hearing, phone in hand, running along the bank toward the sound. The splashing lasted somewhere close to a minute before it stopped completely, and by the time he reached the spot, the surface had gone flat and quiet again. He called for help immediately. Responders and wildlife officers reached the canal within the hour, but there was nothing visible from the bank by then. Search efforts continued for several hours before Bernard's body was located downstream, caught against a partially submerged branch not far from where he had been sitting. The coroner listed cervical spine injury and drowning as the cause of death, consistent with a forceful pull from the bank, followed by at least one full roll in the water. Contributing factors included the low elevation of the bank relative to the waterline and the darkness that removed any visual warning before the strike occurred. Evidence included the overturned chair, the headlamp recovered still lit near the water's edge, and the account given by the fisherman who heard the attack take place. Wildlife officials increased alligator removal efforts along that stretch of canal in the following months. The fisherman who reached the bank that night stopped fishing there altogether. He said it was not really a decision, more that he just never wanted to set up a chair that close to the water again. Yeah, fishing is relaxing. I get why people love it. But night fishing unsettles me for this exact reason. Inside a South Florida mangrove creek, a woman thought she was taking the calmer route, right up until the underside of her kayak hit an alligator resting against the bank. It was November 3rd, 2020. A narrow mangrove creek wound through a quiet section of South Florida coastline, shallow, tannin dark, and hemmed in by roots on both sides. People liked it because it felt calmer than the open bay nearby. No big waves, no boat traffic, just still water under a tunnel of mangroves. Jacqueline Prentice was 39, a marketing consultant who had taken up kayaking 2 years earlier as a weekend thing. She liked routes that felt removed from everything, and this creek had become one of her regular spots a few times a year. She usually went alone because that was kind of the point. No coordinating, no waiting on anyone, just a quiet stretch of water and a few hours to herself. I get that part completely. Sometimes the best part of a hobby is not having to explain it to anyone. Mangrove creeks in South Florida can hold alligators close to the bank, especially in shallow, shaded water where a kayak might pass directly over them. The water is often stained dark from tannins, so you do not get a clear look below the surface. Alligators usually do not chase kayaks, but if one gets bumped near the bank, a defensive strike can happen fast. In a narrow creek, neither side has much room to separate. Jacqueline had covered most of the route without any issue. She was moving through one of the tighter sections, where mangrove roots pushed into the channel and left only a few feet on either side of the kayak. The water was shallow enough that her paddle sometimes scraped soft bottom, but dark enough that she could not see what was under the hull. The channel bent slightly there, and the roots on the inside turn forced the kayak closer to the bank than it would have been in open water. Then the kayak struck something solid. The marks on the kayak later suggested contact along the lower side of the hull, followed by a strong hit that rolled the kayak over. The kayak flipped in the narrow channel, throwing Jacqueline into water full of roots, mud, and the overturned boat itself. The bite to her lower leg happened during that roll, severe enough to fracture bone and tear through muscle in the calf. That kind of damage takes away the ability to kick or push off with that leg at all. Kayakers who reached her described her thrashing hard early on, consistent with panic setting in fast, though that thrashing likely worked the roots and fabric tighter rather than freeing her. Other kayakers farther down the creek heard the splash first, then one brief call for help. By the time they turned and began paddling back toward her, the channel itself slowed them down. In water that narrow, you cannot just sprint in a kayak. You have to turn, avoid roots, push through branches, and try not to wedge yourself sideways. Jacqueline surfaced close to the bank, but her clothing and one arm were already caught in the roots below the surface. Investigators later found torn fabric snagged there, consistent with her being physically held in place rather than just struggling to swim. With one leg unusable and her upper body partly trapped, swimming clear was never really an option. When the other kayakers reached her, she had already slipped under. They found her partly tangled near the roots and pulled her across the overturned kayak to keep her head above the water. Emergency responders were called immediately, but getting help into that section took time. A small response boat reached the creek first, followed by medics from a nearby access point. Jacqueline could not be revived. The coroner listed drowning as the cause of death. The leg injury alone was not fatal, but combined with the physical entanglement in the roots and the panic response documented by witnesses, she was left unable to surface fully or free herself in time. Contributing factors included the severity of the leg injury, the entanglement in submerged roots, and the narrow, current-limited channel that slowed rescue efforts. I think mangrove creeks are beautiful, but they would make me nervous in a way open water does not. Once you are inside one, the water, roots, and all the banks all start working like a maze. And when something goes wrong in a maze, getting out is the whole problem. At a South Florida apartment complex, the Alligator had learned people meant food, and a maintenance worker clearing brush became the person standing closest to the bank. It was July 22nd, 2024. A stormwater pond sat behind an apartment complex in South Florida, bordered by a walking path, trimmed grass, and a small seating area residents used in the evenings. A resident alligator had been seen there for years, and most people in the complex knew to expect it somewhere in the water. Elijah Boone was 37, a maintenance technician who had worked at the property for a little over a year. His job was a mix of repairs, trash pickup, pressure washing, and seasonal vegetation work around the pond. He had seen the alligator plenty of times while working near the water, usually floating near the far bank or sliding under when people came too close. After a while, it became part of the job site. Alligators that get fed by people can lose their natural caution fast. They start connecting people with food instead of distance, and that is when a wild animal becomes much harder to predict. Florida warns people about this constantly for a reason. Feeding an alligator does not make it friendly. It teaches it to come closer. Several residents later said people had been feeding the alligator for years, usually scraps tossed from the seating area or path, despite the warning signs. Some treated it like a neighborhood mascot. Others complained that it had started approaching people instead of sinking away. The difference was probably how close they had been when it moved toward them. One resident said she stopped letting her kids play near that section of the walking path months earlier, though she never filed anything formal about it. I have never understood the neighborhood mascot thing with animals that can kill you. A duck? Sure. A stray cat? Fine. An alligator in a pond behind your apartment building feels like a pretty terrible candidate. On the afternoon of July 22nd, Elijah was clearing overgrowth along the pond edge, cutting back grass and brush where it had started spilling over the waterline. He had worked that stretch before. The job required him to face the vegetation, bend forward, and turn partly away from the pond while he trimmed the bank. The coworker who reached him did not see the first contact, but the bite pattern and the drag marks at the bank told the story clearly enough. The alligator caught Elijah high on the inner thigh and pulled backward toward the pond. That pull widened the injury and made the bleeding worse almost immediately. Elijah grabbed a nearby fence post and held on. That kept him from being pulled fully into the water, but the bite had already caused catastrophic damage. The femoral artery runs through the upper thigh, and a deep bite there can cause fatal blood loss within minutes. He was still trying to stay on land when another maintenance worker heard the struggle and ran over. Elijah stayed conscious longer than the injury probably should have allowed, still gripping the fence post and telling his coworker to call someone, which made the next few minutes feel even harder for the person watching it happen. The coworker pulled Elijah farther from the bank as the alligator released and moved back into the water. Once Elijah was clear, the bleeding became the emergency. The coworker called for help, then used shirts and towels from the maintenance cart to press against the wound. The problem was location. Upper thigh bleeding is hard to control even with both hands on it, and without a tourniquet or proper trauma supplies, Direct pressure was not enough. Emergency responders arrived within several minutes. Elijah had already lost consciousness before they reached him. They continued treatment at the scene, but he could not be revived. The coroner listed exsanguination as the cause of death, caused by severe femoral artery damage from a single powerful bite to the upper thigh. Contributing factors included the alligator's habituation to being fed, prior complaints about it approaching people near the path, and the fact that no removal had taken place. Evidence included resident statements, earlier complaints, the co-worker's account, and blood staining along the pond edge. The alligator was captured and removed afterward. I think this one says a lot about what happens when people turn wild animals into entertainment. Nobody thinks tossing scraps into a pond is part of an attack weeks or months later, but that is exactly how the animal learns who to walk toward.